I was in my office that morning, sifting through binders full of prep notes for a Senate oversight hearing when the notification hit my phone. It was a summons, federal court. The name at the bottom made my stomach lurch, Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General and now a rising figure on the national stage, had just been named in a controversial case involving alleged obstruction of federal legal protocols tied to a politically sensitive investigation. It was the kind of charge that sounded serious, but lacked concrete public details, intentionally vague, which often meant something deeper was brewing. Pam wasn't going in alone. She had requested counsel from an unlikely figure, Karoline Leavitt, a name dismissed by many as too young, too inexperienced, or worse, too politically charged. But those who underestimated her had clearly never seen her argue under pressure. As the media swarmed the marble steps of the D.C. Circuit Court, Leavitt walked ahead of Pam, calm as ever, a folder in her hands and a plan in her eyes. Inside the chamber, the air was electric. Cameras were not allowed, but everyone knew this hearing would shake the political walls of Washington. Judge Barrett entered, robed and stern, her eyes sweeping the room before she fixed her gaze directly on Bondi. Without ceremony, she announced her intentions clearly. Ms. Bondi, this court has reviewed sufficient cause to consider pre-trial detention due to the severity and public impact of your alleged interference, gasps echoed. Pam's face remained stoic. But Karoline Leavitt stood up slowly, smoothed her jacket, and spoke her first words with an even tone. Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe the court is acting on incomplete, if not manipulated, evidence. And I'm prepared to prove it, right now. The silence was deafening. Even Judge Barrett looked momentarily taken aback. And just like that, the entire courtroom, and the legal fate of Pam Bondi, pivoted to the untested brilliance of a young legal mind most had dismissed. Judge Barrett raised an eyebrow. Her gavel hovered in the air, uncertain for a moment. You may proceed, Ms. Leavitt, she said cautiously, her tone dipped in skepticism. Karoline stepped forward, placing the folder gently on the bench's document tray. This contains internal memos from the DOJ, time-stamped and signed, that directly contradict the affidavit this court is relying on, she said clearly, her voice calm but forceful. These documents were omitted from the official case file. Barrett's eyes narrowed. She motioned to her clerk, who retrieved the folder and began scanning its contents rapidly. A hush fell over the courtroom as every eye was locked on the federal judge's changing expression. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers tapped restlessly against the bench. Karoline wasn't done. I'd also like to call attention to precedent from United States v. Harmon, which ruled that pre-trial detention based on politically influenced affidavits was grounds for immediate dismissal. Pam Bondi didn't blink. She was watching Barrett, who was now reading more quickly, more aggressively. The clerk leaned in and whispered something into her ear. Barrett's face froze. Leavitt took one step back, letting the weight of her words and evidence settle into the judge's mind like lead. This wasn't legal misconduct, Your Honor, Karoline continued. This was legal entrapment. And Ms. Bondi was the target. Barrett's fingers clenched around the gavel, but she didn't bring it down. Instead, she stood slowly, eyes burning with something between disbelief and reluctant respect. This hearing is suspended until further internal review, she announced, her voice unsteady. Ms. Bondi will not be remanded into custody. Gasps. Whispers. Reporters scribbling notes like their pens were on fire. Pam turned toward Karoline and whispered, What did you just do? Karoline didn't look at her. She just stared straight ahead. I gave her a reason to think twice. Within minutes, the courtroom emptied like a leaking balloon, journalists chasing signals, aides on phones, federal clerks whispering in corners. But behind the sealed doors of Judge Barrett's chambers, the atmosphere was different. Tense. Controlled. Karoline Leavitt had been summoned, alone. She stood silently as the thick oak doors shut behind her, sealing her inside with one of the most powerful judicial figures in the country. Judge Barrett circled her desk like a hawk. You've studied constitutional law, yes? She asked bluntly. I have, Karoline replied without hesitation. You're young. I'm not here to impress you with my age. Barrett stared at her for a long, heavy moment. You blindsided me, the judge finally said, eyes sharp. Nobody outmaneuvers my bench. Not at this level. Karoline took a slow breath. With respect, Your Honor, you weren't outmaneuvered. You were misled. I just gave you the chance to see it. Barrett didn't speak right away. She walked back to her chair and sat, folding her hands. How did you get those documents? The ones the DOJ claimed didn't exist. Karoline's response was quiet, but firm, through legal means. The documents weren't classified, just inconvenient. I filed a Freedom of Information request the day after Bondi was named in the case. No one expected me to know where to look. Barrett studied her in silence, her expression unreadable. Then finally, you may have just saved her career. Karoline responded without blinking. That wasn't my goal. Barrett leaned forward. Then what was? To remind the court that power doesn't make you right. Proof does. The judge said nothing, but the smallest flicker of something, was it respect, touched her face before she waved toward the door. Get her out of my courtroom, Leavitt. But tell Bondi, she owes you everything. As Karoline turned to leave, Barrett added quietly, and if you ever come back in here, bring armor. Karoline didn't smile. She simply nodded, walked out, and closed the door behind her, leaving Judge Amy Coney Barrett alone with her thoughts, and the sudden weight of being wrong. By the time Karoline stepped back into the courthouse hallway, the media frenzy had mutated into something else, curiosity mixed with awe. Pam Bondi was standing at the far end of the corridor, arms crossed, flanked by aides and security. When she saw Karoline approaching, she didn't move at first. Just studied her. Then, without a word, Pam walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. You just flipped the script on the highest bench in the land, she said quietly. And you did it without blinking. Karoline shook her head. This isn't over. Judge Barrett's pride may be bruised, but the people who fed her that bad intel? They're still in play. They won't let this slide. Pam's eyes sharpened. Then neither will we. Reporters surged forward, snapping photos and shouting questions. Ms. Bondi, do you believe the case was politically motivated? Ms. Leavitt, are you prepared for the backlash from the DOJ? Is Judge Barrett going to recuse herself? Karoline didn't answer. But her silence said enough. By the time they reached the black SUV idling at the curb, the political machinery of D.C. was already turning on itself. Inside the vehicle, Pam scrolled through her phone. You're trending, she muttered, showing Karoline a headline, Karoline Leavitt, the legal prodigy who outmaneuvered a Supreme Court justice. Karoline looked at the screen but said nothing. Pam glanced over. You realize this makes you a target, right? I was one the moment I filed that FOIA request, Karoline replied. The only difference is now they know I'm not afraid of them. The car pulled away from the courthouse as helicopters circled overhead and news anchors speculated wildly. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't listening. She was already thinking 5 steps ahead, because what had just happened wasn't a victory. It was the opening shot of something far, far bigger. That evening, Karoline sat in a dimly lit conference room, the blinds drawn, security stationed outside the door. Pam had called a private meeting, just the two of them and one trusted aide. The political world was on fire, but behind closed doors, the real storm was forming. Pam poured 2 glasses of water and slid one across the table. They'll come at you sideways now, she said flatly. Not with subpoenas, at least not right away. First, they'll try to discredit you. Personal leaks. Character smears. Maybe even back-channel pressure on your credentials. Karoline nodded. I know. Pam leaned forward. No. I mean they'll dig through everything. College essays, old roommates, donations you didn't even know someone made in your name. This city doesn't forgive embarrassment, and you just embarrassed one of its high priests. I didn't do it for the spotlight, Karoline said. Pam smirked. You didn't have to. They'll give it to you anyway. And they'll weaponize it. Karoline opened a folder of her own. Inside were 3 more FOIA requests, each stamped and filed, targeting individuals connected to the false affidavit in Pam's case. This isn't just about you anymore, she said. The documents they buried? They weren't just sloppy. They were coordinated. And if I'm right, there's a pattern going back months. Pam's smile faded. You think there's a task force? Off the books. Karoline nodded slowly. And I think Barrett wasn't the mastermind. She was just the blade. A long silence followed. The gravity of the situation was settling into all 3 of them like cold fog. This wasn't just a legal win. It was a fracture in something much bigger, something hidden, something protected by people who didn't tolerate exposure. Finally, Pam stood. Then we dig. Quietly. Thoroughly. And next time, Karoline finished the sentence for her, we don't just defend. We expose. Outside the building, a black car idled longer than it should have. Someone was watching. The next morning, Karoline's apartment building had an unmarked SUV parked across the street. She noticed it immediately, but didn't flinch. Surveillance was expected now. It was confirmation she had struck a nerve. Inside her apartment, every device was on airplane mode. She worked offline, old school, printed files, handwritten notes, and a corkboard on the wall filled with red thread connections like something out of an espionage thriller. She wasn't paranoid, she was methodical. Names were emerging. Quiet bureaucrats. Mid-level staffers buried in federal agencies. Legal clerks with no public profile, but deep ties to specific political operations. The more she dug, the more obvious it became, someone had built a network to use the legal system as a weapon. Not just against Bondi. Against anyone who disrupted the status quo. That afternoon, she met Pam at a secure location, a nondescript office above a print shop in Arlington. The place was chosen for its obscurity, not comfort. Pam was already there with a laptop and a grim look. They've started scrubbing profiles, she said, turning the screen. 3 of the DOJ aides listed in that first memo. Their work histories are vanishing. One's already resigned. Another transferred without public notice. Karoline leaned in. That's damage control. They're nervous. Pam closed the laptop. We need more than nerves. We need a name. The person who built this. Karoline walked to a small safe in the corner and opened it. Inside was a flash drive, discreet, labeled only with a date. I pulled this from a sealed docket tied to an immigration case in New Mexico. Judge Barrett signed off on it, but it had nothing to do with her jurisdiction. It was buried under layers of legal noise. Pam took the drive cautiously. What is it? Karoline looked her dead in the eyes. A name. Or at least, the first breadcrumb. Pam didn't ask how she got it. She just nodded and whispered, let's follow it. But outside, 2 floors down, someone else had already started tracking them. Not with cameras. Not with microphones. With clearance. 48 hours later, Karoline's email was hit with an alert from a cybersecurity contact she trusted, an encrypted message with only 2 words in the subject line, they're inside. She didn't wait to read the rest. She slammed her laptop shut, yanked the battery, and tossed it into a signal-blocking pouch. This wasn't a phishing scam or routine surveillance. Someone had triggered a classified firewall, level red. That meant government-level intrusion, not just wiretaps or monitoring. It meant someone inside the intelligence community had authorized digital access, and likely, physical shadowing. Minutes later, Karoline met Pam in a parking garage. They didn't speak at first, just exchanged looks. "You felt it too?" Pam asked. Karoline nodded. "They're not covering tracks anymore. They're flexing." Pam leaned against the concrete pillar, jaw clenched. "The flash drive you gave me, there was more than a name. There were signatures. 3 judges, one of them retired, but still accessing sealed cases under emergency permissions." Karoline pulled out a printed sheet from her coat pocket. "Here's the real kicker. One of the signatures isn't real. It's a forgery, verified against archived court docs from 2018. Pam froze. "You're saying someone faked judicial authorization to push cases through?" "Exactly. And Barrett unknowingly gave legal weight to those orders. Which means she wasn't just used, she was compromised. That changed everything. Because now, Barrett wasn't just a judge who made a mistake. She was a vector, someone whose name and title were hijacked to legalize what never should have been legal." Pam's voice dropped to a whisper. "This isn't a task force. This is an embedded cell." Karoline scanned the garage. "And we're not the only ones who know it now." A black sedan rolled past slowly. Neither woman moved. Neither flinched. They had just stepped into something bigger than politics, deeper than corruption. They were now enemies of a system that wasn't supposed to exist. And the next move would be theirs, or it would be their last. Back at the federal courthouse, the air had shifted. There was no public announcement. No press briefing. But behind the scenes, Judge Amy Coney Barrett had quietly requested an emergency closed-door conference. And she had asked for one person to be present, Karoline Leavitt. Pam wasn't allowed in. Not this time. Inside the chambers, the tension was thick. Judge Barrett sat alone at the bench, no clerks, no aides, just silence and the sound of Karoline's heels crossing the marble floor. "You wanted to see me?" Karoline asked, folding her arms. Barrett didn't look up immediately. She was staring at a document in her hands, an internal memo with redaction bars so thick it was nearly blacked out. "I've made a mistake," the judge finally said. "And I'm prepared to correct it." Karoline narrowed her eyes. "You're not the one who forged signatures. You're not the one running sealed cases through phantom courts. But you signed orders you didn't vet. That's not just a mistake, it's complicity." Barrett met her gaze. "And if I go public with that, they'll silence me. You know it." "I know it." Karoline didn't flinch. "I want a deal," Barrett said, sliding a folder forward. "These are the names. 3 of them. The core. The ones controlling the channel." Karoline opened the folder slowly, scanning names she'd suspected, but seeing them in Barrett's handwriting made it real. A DOJ deputy director. A federal circuit clerk. And a name she hadn't seen before, Robert Quill. "Who's he?" Karoline asked. Barrett's voice was grim. "The architect. Former intelligence liaison turned private legal consultant. He built this system to move cases under radar. He's the reason you were targeted." Karoline closed the folder and looked up. "What do you want in return?" Barrett exhaled sharply. "An out. Not from justice, but from politics. I want immunity from future federal hearings. I'll resign quietly. No headlines. No legacy ruined." Karoline studied her for a long moment. "You'll testify?" Barrett nodded. "Off record, under seal, until you're ready to bring this system down the right way." Karoline didn't answer immediately. Then finally, "Deal." As she turned to leave, Barrett said one last thing: "They thought you were just a mouthpiece." Karoline paused at the door. "They were wrong," Barrett added. "You're the fire they couldn't see coming." And with that, the war officially changed sides. 3 days later, the war room came to life. It wasn't in a government building or a law office. It was a borrowed basement under a retired senator's bookstore in Alexandria, quiet, overlooked, and shielded from the noise of D.C. Above ground, fiction novels lined dusty shelves. Below, hard truth was being assembled. Pam Bondi, Karoline Leavitt, and a skeleton team of trusted analysts pored over the names Judge Barrett had delivered. The pattern was clearer than ever now: forged judicial approvals, rerouted cases, political blacklists, all funneled through Robert Quill, the mysterious figure at the center of the web. Karoline pinned his photo on the board. "We find him, we crack this wide open." Pam tossed a manila envelope onto the table. "Already working on it. He has a footprint, quiet, but not invisible. Private jets. Offshore meetings. The kind of movement you only get with ex-Intel connections and black-budget money." "Why haven't we heard his name before?" one analyst asked. Karoline answered, "Because he doesn't want power. He wants control. Different ambition. Less noisy. More dangerous." Suddenly, the monitor on the wall lit up. A secure line buzzed once. Karoline clicked in. It was Judge Barrett, only this time, her voice was urgent. "I just received notice. There's been a leak. Someone in my chambers, someone I didn't suspect, has informed Quill that his name was handed over." Pam's face tightened. "You need to move," Barrett continued. "You're not safe. And if you're going after Quill, you need to do it now." The line cut. No time for questions. Karoline looked at Pam. "We need to corner him before he disappears." Pam nodded. "We flush him out." "Where?" someone asked. Karoline tapped a location on the map. "The next sealed hearing is in New York. Tomorrow. It's a cover. Quill will be there, off the books, behind the curtain." Pam's eyes narrowed. "Then we show up where we're not invited." Karoline grabbed her coat. "This ends where it started, in a courtroom." The federal courthouse in Manhattan buzzed with its usual rhythm: lawyers in expensive suits, agents in discreet black, and a half-dozen hearings unfolding behind sealed doors. But in courtroom 6C, something unusual stirred. The room had been reserved under emergency procedural grounds. No public notice. No docket number. And inside, sitting at the rear of the chamber like a ghost, was Robert Quill. Dressed in a charcoal suit, no tie, and eyes that scanned the room like a tactician, Quill was everything they expected: calm, invisible, and in complete control. Until he wasn't. The back door opened without warning. Karoline Leavitt walked in first, followed by Pam Bondi and 2 U.S. Marshals under quiet federal orders. Their entrance wasn't loud, but it froze every neck in the room. Quill didn't turn. He simply closed the folder on his lap. "Didn't think you'd be this bold," he said quietly. Karoline stepped forward. "Didn't think you'd be this sloppy." The presiding judge blinked in confusion, until Pam handed over a sealed motion from Judge Barrett herself, a judicial override granting Karoline emergency authority as a special counsel under constitutional oversight. Quill chuckled. Barrett flipped. "I suppose that's my mistake." "You made a bigger one," Karoline replied. "You assumed no one would ever dare dig." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this courtroom and this session have been operating on fraudulent authority. The individual seated at the rear has used forged judicial signatures, falsified agency documents, and coordinated clandestine prosecutions through this venue." The judge looked visibly rattled. "And, do you have proof?" Karoline stepped aside as 2 federal agents entered, placing a digital projector on the bench. Within seconds, the courtroom wall lit up with scanned memos, biometric signatures, and email trails, documents that only someone inside the system could have accessed. Then came the final image. A signed order authorizing the illegal surveillance and targeted prosecution of multiple officials, including Bondi. Signed by Quill. Real name: Robert J. Quinn. former CIA contractor. Disavowed and buried after a covert operation gone sideways overseas. He hadn't just manipulated courts. He was the system for over a decade. The judge turned to him. You have the right to remain silent. For the first time, Quill's cool demeanor cracked. Just slightly. You think this ends here? He asked Karoline. She stepped closer. No. But it starts ending here. The marshals took him without resistance. Outside, the press had no idea what had just happened, yet. But by morning, the headlines would roar. Pam Bondi was cleared of all charges. Judge Barrett submitted her resignation quietly, honoring her word. And Karoline Leavitt? She disappeared from the spotlight, by choice. But inside the deepest circles of Washington, a new name was whispered with caution. The one who beat the system at its own game.